Hey everyone. Before we dive into tonight's horror story, I want to give a shout out to all of you who have subscribed to my channel, those who give me constant support and love these horror stories. And for those of you who are new here, please hit that like button and subscribe so our creepy community can keep growing and these scary stories can reach more people who love this kind of horror. Tonight, I've got a true horror story for you about camping in the Appalachian Mountains. I don't want to spoil anything, but I'm really excited to hear what you think. Let me know in the comments. Enjoy the creepy story and stick around till the end to see how it all wraps up. Camping in the Appalachian Mountains was supposed to be a tradition. Every fall, we, Serena Coleman, Celia Garraway, Hazel Wintringham, Grace Dittman, Tyler White, and Theo Howard loaded up our gear, picked a new spot, and spent a weekend under the stars. It was supposed to be simple. Hiking, drinking, scaring each other with ghost stories. Nothing we hadn't done before. This year, Theo picked the spot. He was the outdoorsy one, always looking for the most authentic experience. He found an old trail deep in the woods, a place with no marked campsites, no other hikers. Perfectly secluded, he said. It took us nearly half a day to get there, cutting through thick trees and winding paths, but the spot was beautiful. An open clearing near a small creek, the mountains looming high above us. That first night was like any other. We sat around the fire, drinking cheap whiskey, roasting marshmallows, and laughing at Theo's awful ghost stories. At some point, Tyler decided to start his usual pranks. He was the kind of guy who thought scaring people was hilarious, sneaking up behind you, shaking tents, tossing little rocks when no one was looking. It was annoying, but harmless. Around 2 a.m., everyone had gone to bed except me and Serena. We sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Then, something heavier moved in the brush. I figured it was Tyler, up to his usual nonsense. "Tyler, go to sleep, man," I called. No answer. A moment later, something pressed against my tent from the outside. A solid weight, pushing in, stretching the fabric. I groaned, irritated. He'd done this before, pressing his ass or his hands against the tent to freak us out. Without thinking, I balled my fist and punched it. Hard. It didn't move. No yelp of pain. No laughter. No running footsteps. Just silence. A cold dread crawled up my spine. I waited, listening, my heart hammering. Then the weight slowly peeled away, the tent shifting back into place. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunched through the leaves. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, nothing. I lay there for what felt like hours before exhaustion finally took over. When we woke up in the morning, the camp was a mess. Dishes were scattered, the firewood was tossed around, and in the dirt just outside my tent were massive paw prints. Not Tyler's, not human. Bear, I told myself. It had to be a bear. The bear tracks should have been enough to send us packing, but we were idiots, young, cocky, and convinced we knew better. It was just looking for food, Theo reasoned, studying the massive prints. We'll keep the fire going at night, hang the food up in the trees. It won't come back. No one wanted to be the one to suggest leaving, so we didn't. That afternoon, we hiked a few miles up the ridge. The higher we climbed, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. Hazel stopped at one point, her face pale. "Does it feel off to you guys?" she asked. None of us wanted to admit it, but yeah, it did. The silence wasn't normal. Something about the trees, the way they stood too still, their branches twisting like frozen hands, it felt wrong. Then, Tyler found the first carcass. A deer. At least, what was left of one. Its body was torn open, ribs exposed, its insides missing. No scavengers had touched it. No maggots, no decay. Just fresh, red meat, as if something had killed it that morning. We stared at it for a long time, until Grace finally said, "Let's go back." No one argued. That night the mood had changed. The whiskey didn't taste as good. The fire didn't feel as warm. We all kept glancing into the darkness, listening. And then the noises started. At first it was soft. Twigs snapping, branches rustling. Normal forest sounds. But then we heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the camp. It wasn't the erratic movement of an animal. It was slow, watching, waiting. "Probably the bear," Theo whispered, gripping his flashlight. But then it laughed. A low, breathy chuckle, just beyond the firelight. Not human. Not entirely. Serena's hand clamped onto my wrist. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. Theo, always the brave one, stood up and shined his flashlight into the trees. Nothing. Just blackness, stretching between the trunks. "We need to get inside the tents," he said. We barely slept. The laughter came again, right behind the tents. I held my breath, waiting, my body rigid. A shadow moved outside, tall and wrong, stretching against the firelight. Then, just like before, something pressed against my tent. Only this time, it wasn't just a weight. It was a hand. A long, thin hand pressing slowly, deliberately, its fingers dragging down the fabric. I didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, just like that, it was gone. In the morning, the tracks were back. Only this time, they weren't bear prints. They were footprints. Bare, human, but too long, too thin. We should have run. We should have packed up right then and there. But we didn't. We should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my gear and go, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Some twisted logic that told us as long as we didn't acknowledge the thing in the woods, it couldn't be real. So we stayed. The plan was simple. We'd stick together, keep the fire blazing, and leave at first light. Theo and Tyler tried to act normal, cracking jokes and passing around the last of the whiskey, but no one laughed. Every sound, every gust of wind, every falling leaf felt like something creeping closer. Then, at midnight, Grace spoke. "We're not alone." Her voice was hollow, empty. We turned to her, and my stomach dropped. Her eyes were locked on something past the fire, something only she could see. Her lips moved soundlessly, her fingers twitching against her knee. "Grace?" Serena whispered. But Grace didn't answer. She stood, slow, mechanical. And then she started walking, straight into the dark. We scrambled to our feet. Theo lunged first, grabbing her arm. "Grace, stop!" She thrashed violently, letting out a sound that wasn't a scream, Wasn't a cry, just a raw, guttural noise. Her face twisted, her eyes wide with terror, as if she was seeing something we couldn't. Then, from the darkness, the laughter came again, closer. All at once, the fire sputtered and dimmed, shadows stretching unnaturally long. The trees groaned, as if something massive was moving among them, and then we saw it, a shape at the edge of the clearing, too tall, too thin, its limbs wrong. The firelight barely touched it, as if the darkness clung to its skin. It stood motionless, watching. Then it took a step, and another. Tyler screamed. That was all it took to break the spell. We ran, grabbing whatever we could, tearing through the woods in a blind panic. The trees blurred past me, my lungs burning. Behind us, I heard crashing, snapping, something moving fast, too fast. Celia tripped. I spun back, grabbing her, hauling her to her feet. We didn't look back. We didn't stop running until we saw the first sliver of dawn breaking through the trees. When we finally reached the main road, we collapsed, gasping for breath. No one spoke. No one dared. Grace was the first to break the silence. It wasn't a bear, she whispered. No one argued. We left everything behind. Our tents, our gear, our food. Next morning, when we finally got the nerve to report it, rangers went to check the site. They found our camp. But the tents weren't ripped apart. The firewood wasn't scattered. Everything was packed up neatly, carefully, like someone or something had cleaned up after us. But the footprints were still there, leading from the trees, stopping right outside our tents.